Country code is CAR. This is not. Lose to them, how? Embarrassing, no?
So bad, like you.
No, you're uni what?
Really good. Credit.
There's no expectation.
Come on, guy.
Okay, welcome to the fourth round of Western BPIB 2012. My name is Ruben, I'm the chair. Panelists, I have Basan. On the motion, something about giving aliens universal citizenship, I invite the Prime Minister to begin today's debate. Here.
Mr. Speaker, what is this debate about? We think that when we talk about in the context of stateless people, we are referring to individuals who are not recognized as citizens in any states. These people are nomads because they are forced to be nomads, because they have no inherent identity, because their identity is not recognized by any states under cities code. So we're talking about people like the gypsies in France because they got kicked out, because their roots is difficult to be traced because the French refuse to recognize their roots, or even the Rohingyas in Myanmar, Mr. Speaker. This debate is not about refugees, but what is the difference if you're wondering? We think that refugees are citizens of a particular country who get chased out of that particular country due to political, environmental, or humanitarian reasons, right? So these are very different from stateless people, because stateless people you cannot trace where they originally come from, right? So what do you want to do for these stateless people, Mr. Speaker? You want to grant them universal citizenship. Why citizenship and not refugee status? Because inherently when you grant them citizenship, there are more benefits that they might get. For example, they can go to work, they can be part of the public education system, they can get public welfare, they can also contribute back to the country, and we think there are more benefits if you allow them to be a citizen of any states rather than to give them a refugee status. But this is important. What are the mechanisms coming from psychology? First thing, Mr. Speaker, you have to recognize a particular group of people are stateless people. For example, there exists universal consensus by the international communities that the Rohingyas in Myanmar are stateless people. So post this recognition that this particular group are stateless people, so we think that we'll grant them universal citizenship, meaning this group of people, these stateless people, will get to choose which country do you want to go and assimilate and associate themselves with, Mr. Speaker. But we think here's a very important check and balance. Upon that choice has been made, upon that relationship that already exists, for example, if I'm a stateless people and I choose to associate myself with Malaysia, and upon that relationship and upon that choice, they can no longer change their identity and they can no longer change their citizenship, Mr. Speaker, just like that. If they want to change, Mr. Speaker, they have to apply for a change, and after that, the normal procedures is applicable, because at that point, they are no longer stateless people, because at that point, they are citizens of that country whom they already choose to associate themselves with. So I'm going to talk about two things in my speech today. Number one, I'm going to talk about this idea of moral obligation, and secondly, I'm going to analyze further on the nature of citizenship. But before that, he's very pleased.
Why do you think that first world countries that these refugees will inevitably go to, why do you think they should shoulder the majority of the burden for these stateless?
That's when your logic is wrong. Look, just because first world countries or like the West is richer, right, doesn't mean as a Muslim, as a very conservative Orthodox Muslim, I want to go there, right? There are already natural check and balances that like this. I'm going to explain it to you later, I promise. So let's look at the first thing I want to talk about, moral obligation. So we think that there exists a moral obligation because of the principle of common humanity. Common humanity, Mr. Speaker, exists indiscriminately because we're all humans. Why? Because also this idea of birth lottery. Like we all have no control of where and when we're born to or born into, Mr. Speaker. So we think that because there's a bigger force controlling it, some people call it God, or some people believe it just mere life, that you were just born in that particular state. So that puts a lot of people as victims of circumstances, Mr. Speaker. So we think that is unfair because you cannot solely blame the soil in which you come from for all the things that happen and force that particular soil to take all the responsibilities upon you, especially when the country of origin or the place of origin cannot be traced or is not recognized, Mr. Speaker. So we think, Mr. Speaker, because we're all human, because these things are not out of our control, the principle of common humanity, i.e. dignity and respect, should be applicable indiscriminately, Mr. Speaker. We think this is a very important international principle that we have to uphold. That is why we give things like aid, right? For example, if something bad's happened in Africa, even though you're a first world country or even if you're an Asian country, Mr. Speaker, you give aid because the principle of common humanity applies. Because they don't choose to be there, because it's birth lottery, they're victims of circumstances, because you're in a different part of the world, that doesn't mean you can get away from this moral obligation. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we think that it's more important when you make it universal, right? Because when you make it universal, there's no culture of pointing fingers. For example, if you put an impetus on a particular country, then for example, China can say, oh wait, we need United States of America not doing it, we don't want to do it either. So we think our proposal puts away that culture because no country can claim that other countries not taking that burden, because now it is universal. It is upon the choice of the particular stateless people to choose which country they want to associate themselves to, right? So we think that it's also good because in terms of international application, it is applicable to all and there's no such principle as discrimination and things like that. So we think that the impetus to create a culture of being more caring to those in it will also be bigger, right? Because this will be a huge movement by the international community. But secondly, we think that also we think that, Mr. Speaker, political will exist because when you grant them citizenship, right, Mr. Speaker, they can do two things. Number one, they can always contribute back to the country because they'll be a part of the human capital. If you allow them to work, you allow their kids to go to school, their kids in the future can contribute back to your country, right? In fact, they can contribute back to the country as well. So we think that the mutual benefit exists. But more than that, if you give them the status as a citizenship, they will have to respect for laws and policy that your government choose to uphold, to mandate in that particular country, right? So we think that there'll be more respect in terms of relationship that exists afterwards because the relationship is of a legal relationship. But more than that, we think there are natural check and balances, choice. Like just because the country is rich doesn't mean that all these other, for example, all the Rohingyas in Myanmar who suddenly want to go to United States, or I'm pretty sure they don't want to go to Russia, Mr. Speaker, right? But that's just me. But anyways, Mr. Speaker, we think there's already natural check and balances because if you want to associate yourself with another country, you'll take a lot of things into consideration, like identity, like culture, like race and religion, Mr. Speaker. And this allows a lot of people to self-actualize in a better manner. And we think that this will also mitigate the sort of harms that side opposition will want to talk about. Lastly, let's talk about this idea of nature of citizenship. Look, when you give them citizenship, they would now have a stake in the country, right? It enforces the idea of accountability. You also enforces the idea of nationalism and patriotism because you develop a love for a country because now you belong there. You're no longer just, a nomad pretending like you're a part of them but you're not a part of them. It also means that social contract exists, right? You have to give back to the government and the government also have to uphold your rights and things like that. So this creates a legal relationship which then upholds the idea of accountability because your action will be accountable to the states, right? This won't be like the relationship between the gypsies and the Franks. For example, the gypsies like they litter around, they vandalize France, like like how bad the gypsies in France, right? The government hates them so much and they hate the government as well. So we think you remove such a problem because accountability can always be tied back to these stateless people. Right? If they're bad, the government can always punish them and things like that. It also allows for better integration and assimilation, Mr. Speaker, because now the country and also the society recognize them as being a part of the country, Mr. Speaker, because now you create that common ground. We all can relate to each other, Mr. Speaker. In this debate, these stateless people are not recognized. We grant them that choice, Mr. Speaker, and we allow them to pick what's best for themselves, especially when natural check and balances already exist. It is important to have these people for victims of circumstances.
Here.
Thank you, Speaker, for speech. To open the case for the opposition and invite the leader form.
Here. Here.
By the end of the PM speech, the side government was a side that began arguing for rootedness, for people to be connected to a nation, yet advocated universal citizenship for people to go wherever they wanted. And that's the fundamental problem we find with the case. We believe in giving people rootedness and national identity, and it's for this reason we wouldn't grant stateless people universal citizenship. What are we going to do instead? The UN and other non-governmental organizations will enter places inhabited by stateless people, for example, ambiguous border zones, and set up things like social welfare and infrastructure, things such as clinics and schools, which are necessary for their survival and education. Will distribute food to these people if they can't afford to feed themselves. International bodies will encourage states to give refugees citizenship or stateless people citizenship within their own borders. Will encourage states to give these stateless people national citizenship, but we won't compel the states to do so, meaning that if a state can refuse to grant an individual national citizenship based on its own calculus of whether or not it will be beneficial. Next, if states do not consent to the refugees taking up citizenship, no thank you, they can these refugees can therefore live decent lives under our policy by setting up infrastructure for them. So we disagree with their case in two respects. Number one, is that policy reasonable? Number two, what is the real assessment of this whole idea of citizenship? So let's look at the first idea. Is that policy reasonable? First, they told us that their policy only applies to people such as gypsies and those with live along ambiguous border zones, and not to refugees. Firstly, we argue that refugees are an integral part of this debate because they are people who have renounced citizenship of the nation that they are escaping from. For example, a Cambodian refugee, no thank you madam, has renounced his citizenship from Cambodia, and therefore he is fleeing to Thailand. Consequently, we see that refugees should be counted in this debate as people who do not belong to any state. Next, they told us that they will grant them universal citizenship, meaning that they will be able to go to whatever state they want and settle there. So the question I pose to them is, why not grant them national citizenship to this nation? Meaning, why not grant them the ability to apply for citizenship within, say, Malaysia? If you want to live in Malaysia, then go to the Malaysian government, try to apply for citizenship. There's nothing wrong with that. Yes, sir.
If Malaysia was the very reason why a Malaysian suddenly became a stateless person because of internal wars, why would that person be forced to integrate himself in a society that despises him?
Well, he could easily become a refugee and go to another state if Malaysia is one day strucken by civil war. So thank you, madam. Consequently, we see that this isn't really much of a problem in this debate. Next, they told us that there will be rejection in some states due to geopolitical circumstances. This is a problem that isn't mitigated by either side's policy, because there will always be this kind of discrimination in states where these stateless people want to settle in. Consequently, it's not addressed by this debate. So let's move on to the second idea on the real assessment of this notion of citizenship. And I'm going to deal with this on two levels. Principally, why do we grant people citizenship? And practically, what are the benefits of granting or not granting a person citizenship? So let's look at principally, the first idea they gave us on their side was that it is a fundamental right of every individual in the world, every single living person, to belong to a state. So one thing that we argue with them is that we don't really belong to the world, we belong to a state. And the idea that they championed at the end of the speech was rooted identity to a country. If you believe so much in rooted identity, then you should allow people to opt for national citizenship to a country, not universal citizenship, which is something that's amorphous and, well, you can belong to any country you wish. What kind of identity are they promoting on their side? No, thank you. So, moving on to the idea of practically, how do we help these people find better lives? And we see that, no thank you sir, in our policy it's about building facilities. Our policy builds facilities and services for these people in these amorphous border areas so that they can lead better lives. But the last idea they gave us in the end of their speech was that these people, once they enter these societies with their universal citizenship, can become useful members of the workforce and they can earn money and therefore bolster themselves in society. But even though ideally we like to believe that's the case, often that just doesn't happen because these people lack the necessary skill set to succeed in the society that they try to settle in. These people might not necessarily have the same social standing or might be subject to racial discrimination. For example, Mexicans in the USA. Therefore, practically many of these people don't find the dream lives that they want in the countries that they immigrate to. No thank you. So we argue that, no thank you. Now, we argue that granting people national citizenship is beneficial for three reasons. Number one, it upholds the sovereignty of the state. Number two, it decreases the burden of the first world. And my second speaker will tell you why granting universal citizenship devalues citizenship as a concept. So let's look at that first idea, the sovereignty of the state. No thank you. Basically, we have to understand that it's the obligation of every state to care for its people, to things like the redistribution of wealth. And the state therefore has the right to make certain decisions based on its own assessment of the internal circumstances of a country. For example, border controls, because a state maintains territorial integrity over a certain piece of land, and therefore it can decide who it should allow to enter that piece of land, for example, immigrants coming in and out of the territory. Why is this important? Because a state has a finite amount of resources, and it has to prioritize these resources. So the first priority of resources is the people who are accountable to the government, the same people who pay taxes, who vote in the government in democracies. Therefore, the government's primary duty is to the people who are accountable to them and who live under them. So why is it important to not allow people to enter countries as and when they want by their policy of universal citizenship? Because you force and you take away the power of governments to regulate what kind of people they want to see inside their borders. Now, we have to understand that this doesn't mean that governments should be merciless and, not grant aid to poor people and people who are suffering. Certainly governments should do that, but they shouldn't involve granting these people citizenship because governments have other interests at hand, such as prioritizing resources towards their own people. Consequently, we see that the state should retain the supreme right to decide who it wants to enter its borders. And therefore, the international community and the UN as a whole has no right to tell a state that you have to accept a certain person within their borders. Secondly, let's look at the idea of increasing the burden on the first world. Essentially, refugees and poor people who are stateless will tend to seek first world, will tend to go to and try to settle in first world nations once they have been granted their universal citizenship policy, especially in cases of shared borders. I brought to you the idea of Thailand and Cambodia. What we're going to see in these cases like this are many refugees or many people who are stateless in Cambodia trying to emigrate to Thailand because of the better quality of resources there, because of the better quality of social welfare. And therefore, these third world nations which the people are originating from shirk the responsibility of caring for these people who choose to emigrate and seek universal citizenship in other states. And this increases the burden and the stress on the first world's resources and social welfare to care for its citizens, because then it has to accommodate a much larger and much increased citizen pool. Therefore, we do what's best for both the first world countries as well as stateless people. Go with our side.
Thank the speaker for his speech. To continue the case for the government and invite the deputy panelists. Hey.
Mr. Speaker, we think it's a huge concession made by side-opening opposition when they concede to the fact that these states need to help these individuals and give them refugee status, as well as give them shelter and food, recognizing the problem within the status quo that we have with stateless people. But where do we draw the line, and what best handles these individuals more? Do we give them a temporary solution of having refugees and shoulder the constant burden of giving them shelter, give them food, give them clothing and things like that, or give them citizenship, allowing them to have a stake in society and allowing them to contribute back towards the economy however way that they could, even if that means having low-skilled jobs, Mr. Speaker? We still think there's at least a utility that these individuals possess when we give them citizenship. So we think that our proposal is much better. So first of all, let's look at the first rebuttal, whether their counter proposal will necessarily work, Mr. Speaker. We told you when you allow them refugee status, there's still the idea of refugee not only ties into the idea of universal responsibility, conceding that all of these states have a universal responsibility to take in the stateless individuals, but second of all, we don't think it's very sustainable, because when it comes to citizenship, it gives you a permanent form of sort of home in order for you to make a life and have a stake within society. And how did they respond to that? Well, they're low skill set and therefore they can't really contribute, Mr. Speaker. But at least under our paradigm, there's some utility in providing them with a citizenship rather than allowing to burdening the state together, Mr. Speaker. And we don't think that under your paradigm, suddenly you can encourage national citizenship simply because, first of all, a lot of these individuals or stateless people, it's hard to trace them back towards their nationalities. For example, the gypsies in France, Mr. Speaker, we don't know if they're from Romania or from Germany or things like that. So it's hard to encourage that. But second of all, for example, Rohingyas in Myanmar, Mr. Speaker, the government already abhors them, Mr. Speaker. In their constitution, they don't recognize them as citizens. So there's no way that your counter proposal will work simply because these individuals will be constantly stuck in a state of limbo. Therefore, we think that in terms of universal citizenship, it's much better to give them that choice because we think it's principally consistent for them to have that choice of choosing whichever country they want to be a citizen in, but limiting those choices to ensure that the kind of productivity and the kind of sustainability and utility that these people can give back towards the country is also in existence, Mr. Speaker. That's why we think that's the distinction between the status quo. That's why we think that choice should exist. Second rebuttal, sovereignty of the state, Mr. Speaker. We never say that you have to prioritize these individuals more than your people. Of course, your primary responsibility is towards the people, Mr. Speaker. But prioritization of these individuals doesn't come at the cost of taking away all resources towards the people and how you handle your people more. That's why we give you a lot of humanitarian aid, Mr. Speaker, even if your country is in a recession, because we agree to the principle of common humanity that the states need to assist these individuals who are victims of circumstances within the status quo, Mr. Speaker, especially when the idea of globalization is more of a social construct within our status quo, when a lot of immigrants are moving in and out and getting citizenship based on the utility. We're giving these individuals, stateless people, the utility that these countries need in order to accept them within their folds. And we're going to tell you further why it's not just going to burden the first world countries, because we've already told you that we're not just going to move towards the first world countries, because first of all, it's hard to get there, Mr. Speaker. But second of all, you might not necessarily share the same culture and religious beliefs that cater to my and even if, Mr. Speaker, we think they can handle it much better than other forms of developed countries, that's not really a problem. But before moving on to my civil substantives, yes, Sadiq or anyone.
We asked your first speaker, are you accepting of refugees who have universal citizenship? Can you get back to us on that?
Mr. Speaker, we say it very, very clear that we're talking about stateless individuals. If stateless individuals have also the status of refugees, then fine, our principle still stands at the end of the day. The characterization still exists. We don't understand why you're so nitpicky, Mr. Speaker. But first of all, let's look at the counterbalance of arbitrary acts within the status quo. We think when it comes to refugees or even stateless people, there are a lot of political sentiments that are interrelated to these individuals being stateless to start with. For example, they are kicked out simply because the government don't recognize them as individuals or people who have the same set of identity. So a lot of time it's very hard to cater to the stateless people simply because it's highly politicized. For example, with Rohingya, these individuals from Myanmar, Mr. Speaker, Asian countries cannot or are in a political dilemma on whether or not to take these refugees or stateless individuals because they have a tie or loyalty towards the countries that kick them out to start with. For example, even with EU, that's why all of the countries in the EU find a disability or find it hard to take in these gypsies, even though their common humanity and their principle is to give these individuals aid, Mr. Speaker, because of that political connotation. When we say that it's a universal responsibility and it's a universal citizenship that needs to be awarded to this individual, it sends a very strong message to states all over the world that everyone has an equal stake in this, regardless of the political sentiments that's attached to why those individuals became stateless to start with, Mr. Speaker. So it doesn't put this individual state in a dilemma whether or not to accept these individuals, because more likely than not, first world countries have the capability and have the resources to accept these individuals, but because of different political sentiments and the fear of antagonizing certain countries, they are forced to not take them in, even though they want to, Mr. Speaker. We say the second benefit is that these countries who declare these people stateless people are also less likely to declare these people stateless people or to kick them out to start with, because there's now counterbalance to mitigate those actions, Mr. Speaker, because there's now going to be international scrutiny, because now it's a universal duty that every state has to undertake. So it's much harder, or it's less easier, or gives less incentives for Myanmar to just suddenly say, I don't like you, we want to declare you stateless people because we don't recognize you at all and we hate you, Mr. Speaker. But second of all, it also makes regulation a lot better, because now we have a tangible account of this individual stateless people. Because the problem within the status quo is not that it's not that states cannot cater to them, it's that these people are constantly forced to move here and there simply because
states never give them a permanent solution, and they can never settle down. Even as a refugee, Mr. Speaker, there's no permanency in that. The moment the empathy runs out, I have to move to another country, Mr. Speaker. So we think the regulation is much better because now you have certain ties towards the society. Moving on nicely to my second subsentence, in terms of the inevitable dilemma of stateless people, Mr. Speaker, it's not just the idea of having utility within the state. The reason why refugees, even within the status quo, get a lot of animosity from the people of the society is because I see them as disgusting, as scum, people feeding off my country without giving back any form of utility, Mr. Speaker. We say when you give them a citizenship, it's not just a benefit, but it's also a responsibility that you have to make sure you don't steal in order to get food or money. You have to be productive back towards the economy, and it's much easier for them to integrate when they have that choice of universal citizenship to choose the country that best caters them or best able to accommodate towards their culture, Mr. Speaker. And when society sees them as citizens, it's much more likely for them to be accepted within society, especially when these people are now employees. Your janitor, maybe, Mr. Speaker. But the idea sticks that these people now have a stake in the society and they're much easier to integrate. And we think that's much better for the long run. Thank you.
Thanks, Speaker, for a speech. Honoring case for the opposition, invite Diego.
So what they never considered, right, beyond whether or not we should help these people, is whether or not the state can help them. Because the emphasis of their case never considered the fact that states are limited by resource constraints, that states are limited by the discrimination of the people against immigrants. They never considered that, right? And we don't think that the state is some automaton that doesn't care about other people. We are not saying that we don't want humanitarian aid. But what we say is that if you're going to help these people, you help them in the most practical way possible. Because there are reasons for sovereignty. There are reasons for states to limit the entry of people into their country. Why? Because they need to maximize resources, to maximize the benefit to their population. We argue that there are going to be several practical problems if you want to allow universal citizenship to these stateless people, right? So let's look at 2 points for this debate. First, on policy, and second, who best helps these people. So, firstly on policy, right, we argue that one big practical problem with their side was that no, you're going to place an unfair burden upon the first world. And so their response to this was to say, hey, you know, it's fair that first world nations shoulder more of this burden. And to which they say, this is absolutely ridiculous. We think that every state should share equally in the burden of helping these people, right? And furthermore, what we say, right, is that the problem with this is that these first world countries are usually limited in land. This is a common characteristic across first world countries that happens to be a geopolitical phenomenon. And therefore we say, what is the effect of this? It means that your social services and your land are going, and especially your housing, are going to be hurt especially hard, right? The second question they asked, oh, what about refugees, right? They told us this was a nitty-gritty issue. But why is this significant, right? Because if they think that refugees have a different plight from stateless people, we think that if they concede, right, that they're going to grant these refugees the status of stateless people, then it means there's room for exploitation of the system, because refugees are practically people who renounce their citizenship. And we don't want to set the legal precedent of people renouncing their citizenship just to get into another country. But on the other hand, we think it's ludicrous for team government anyway to deny that refugees are stateless people. Why? Because if I'm chased out of my country by brutal civil wars and a genocidal dictator, it's only fair that I be able to be treated in the same way as a stateless person. So then, having that with their policy, right, the last question they raised was, is it long term? Here we argue on the basis of two things, right? Jobs and housing. First, we argue that even if you accept them as citizens in your country, they're not going to be employed. Why? Because there's local discrimination against that. And I'm going to do that more in my substantive about devaluing citizenship, right? But second problem, we argue that this is a problem of housing as well. These people need to be housed. And either, number one, they're going to need the money to buy houses themselves, which obviously isn't the case for a lot of stateless people. Or number two, you're going to overcrowd the already strained public housing that these people have. We argue that this not only hurts the stateless people, it hurts the citizens of the country, because now your living conditions are overcrowded. You're going to have problems with sanity, with sanitization, sorry. And you're going to have problems with the well-being of people in this overcrowded public housing, right? So on these 2 points, we think we take the idea about policy. But before that, opening.
With national citizenship, you are still forcing a particular state to accept these people. But secondly, as refugees, government will spend more money because government need to feed them, provide them a place to stay, but they cannot contribute back to the society. So what's your problem?
It's very simple, right? These refugees don't currently have the skills to contribute back. So what are we doing? We're going to give them the education first, but what is specific about our education system, right? We don't want our education system to be discriminatory against the immigrants. We think we set up schools in the places where these stateless people are. We think it's better, and they don't suffer the problem of having lousier schools and discrimination by their classmates, as opposed to if they go to school, for example, if gypsies go to school in France, we think it's absolutely ridiculous that they get a fair treatment in the state system because of the discrimination against them. So that point falls. Secondly, who helps stateless people, right? And a lot of the things that they talked about, identity, you know, finding an identity for themselves of the country of our choosing, we need to recognize that the society they integrate into has a say as well. That the society has a voice in the democratic government that decides or not whether these people can be accepted by this country. And if that democratically elected government opposes the entry of these stateless people, it means that the majority of people dislike that particular race, that particular ethnicity, and we don't want to challenge this discrimination. But what's the problem then, right? Given this pre-existing discrimination, we think it makes it worse for stateless people when they choose to go into a country without a government first accepting them. This is because when the majority of the population doesn't like them, we think there's not going to be acceptance of their culture, right? We don't think there's going to be acceptance at all. Second idea about resources and sovereignty, right? We're going to raise several examples, right? There's a reason why you have to apply for a green card or a visa to go into the USA in the first place. Why? Because the state places a value on choosing which people go into their country, right? Because as a democratically elected government, right, this society does have a certain choice as to what they're going to do. But how is this detrimental? That it means that they are unable to find their own cultural identity in the midst of all this discrimination that takes place. Secondly, we argue that there's going to be practical problems, right? States don't allow millions of people to flood their borders at once. Why? Because they can't take care of so many people.
Just one.
Because if their resources are already strained, then no, they're not going to be able to take care of these people. You're going to leave these stateless people with even less help than in the places where we provide infrastructure for them. Closing.
Stop putting your arguments on just a pragmatic basis, because principally you're already conceding that these people deserve help and that these countries should give those help to them.
Sure.
If you're saying they can't afford it, then
Sure, we give you two responses to that, right? First, my first speaker already talked about sovereignty. That's the principal idea, that the state should choose who should go to their borders. We're not against humanitarian aid, and we think we're doing enough in terms of providing infrastructure for them to provide aid, right? But secondly, you ask, well, who are we, to help them if we don't have enough money? Precisely because they don't have enough money. We think that practically, it's easier to help build infrastructure than force them to make out a living with no education and no training, and forcing them to buy housing in this area as opposed to building housing for them. We think if we force them with no money to go into a country, then it's going to be practically detrimental to them. Why? Because they have no money to buy housing, and we're going to lead to the problems that we said. Okay, so last, right, we're going to introduce the idea of devaluing citizenship, right? Basically, they said, well, the citizens in these countries, and I quote the second speaker, right, view them as scum, lower people, lower human beings, right? And precisely this problem, right, that granting them citizenship devalues them, because the majority of citizens in that country no longer feel that their citizenship is worth anything, right? Because, well, this scum of the earth has come and taken citizenship, enjoyed the same benefits that my government gives out. Let me tell you that this prioritization of the government gone wrong hurts both the immigrants into the country as well as the citizens. Therefore, we best provide for the needs of these stateless people, and we help the state to help them best.
thank the speaker for his speech. That ends the opening half of the debate. To begin the closing half, I invite the member of government. Okay.
We think that primary culpability, or the reason why people become stateless, is attributed to an international community fueled by political war. Here, we detach ourselves from the consequences of collateral damage, that in the event that we recognize a state and disrecognize another state, people suffer while we gain our egos in the international arena. We think this liability is direct, and people, including the people of the First World, who primarily fueled this conflict in the Middle East, who primarily fueled this conflict in Africa, are responsible, and that's why we think universal entitlement in terms of any and all nations is appropriate. I'm going to argue two things. The first on that direct liability, and I'm going to illustrate it on multiple levels, concluding that yes, you do have a responsibility for these people. Secondly, I'm going to discuss the irony of keeping and sequestering refugees in camps, and why this is the only policy that could be followed if we take negative model. Firstly, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to separate my rebuttals, because they were weird. Let's go to the first argument on rebuttal. They talked about the social contract point, right? They said that states, it's really different, that's why I can't integrate it. They say states have a finite amount of resources. I think they took this out of the textbook. We think, Mr. Speaker, that this is a generalization. In fact, we contest that mathematically it costs more to wage war in Israel and Palestine than it is to bring in a few million people to your borders working in jobs that maybe your people don't even want to work in. Like bussing tables at McDonald's, like collecting your garbage. We think that the First World has already learned its lesson. That's why we have an aging population. We think that this argument was underanalyzed at best and maliciously deceptive at worst. Second rebuttal. They talked about decreasing burdens, right? And the conclusion of this argument was, you want people not to be responsible for other people's, problems. We think that this is untrue. That's why you have UN conventions and the principle of non-refoulement, saying that it's not an option for you to turn them away. It's either you make them your refugees or you allow them to naturalize. Those are your two options. So this argument concludes at a point where there's no practical application. But we think that on principle, no thank you, this encourages a really bad mindset. That nations aren't in charge of their neighbors, that nations aren't caring about their neighbors. We think that in that regard, it's contradictory for them to say that you'd continue humanitarian aid if your policy is one that's selfish enough to say that you have no responsibility over conflicts that you could have possibly started. We think that this makes no sense. But lastly, they say it's about discrimination. We think, Mr. Speaker, that the answer to discrimination should be cracking down on discrimination. Because we think that there's an assumption here, right? That in America, there are only Americans. In the UK, there are only the British. In Malaysia, there is only the Bumiputro. Well, that's another debate. But what I'd like to suggest, Mr. Speaker, is that nations aren't culturally homogenous. This means that the moment you encourage a policy that discriminates, for example, the Arakanese who came from Bangladesh and not the Arakanese who come from Myanmar, then you're encouraging your population to discriminate people who are different from the majority of that population. We think that this is unconducive to cultural health, and we think this is socially abhorrent. So lastly, this is a really long one. Let's weigh, right? There are three scenarios which we could foresee in negative bench. The first one is that you force these people to stay and die. That's not an option. I discussed it about non-refoulement. The second one is about sequestering. I'm going to illustrate later why camps will always be a worse option, talking about stagnation, talking about how it's a bad deterrent, and talking about how it fosters enmity. But finally, no thank you, you're going to end up paying them to live. And I'm going to argue a really short practical benefit here, almost rebuttal, a little bit constructive. We think that it's good that they get to enter these first world nations, assuming the best of the policy. They get to take jobs which Americans wouldn't want to have. They get to find livelihood that they wouldn't have had in entrenched border zones, which they want to keep them in. And we think, Mr. Speaker, that this is constructive and it fosters long-term development. We think that in that regard, if you're going to wait, keeping them between borders and bringing them to the first world, it's much better for everyone if we put them in the first world. Go ahead.
So your first speaker told you that, it's about getting citizenship to stop discrimination. Why is your policy even relevant if you could ban discrimination altogether then?
Because discrimination happens in the mind, Mr. Speaker. We think that in terms of cultural modification, cultural regulation, you need policies that do affirmative action. We think that there are numerous debates which will tackle that, but not this one. So the first argument. Why is it, Mr. Speaker, that the international community is directly liable for the statelessness of people? I'm going to bring in 3 case studies to make this debate a high-quality one. First, ethnic Russians in South Ossetia. Second, ethnic Serbians in Kosovo. Third, the Arakanese, which I mentioned earlier. What happened here? The international community recognized the independence of South Ossetia in favor and against the independence of Georgia and Russia. They recognized Kosovo in opposition to Serbia. This meant that, politically, you had a goal in mind, which was to recognize which was sovereign, which would tactically help your allies. Basically, it's political power play at best. However, while we can see that that's fair to do in the international community, because that's how nations work, collateral damage happens to people outside those governments and sovereignties. These are people who will be displaced. People who don't consider themselves ethnic Kosovar, people who have homes in Kosovo, but of a different country. We think that this is where the grave confusion happens very clearly. It's not about illegal immigrants, because those people declare that they're not members of their nations. This debate is about stateless people who were disowned by their previous nations, who have to live in countries which they don't want to live in, Andy's point very clearly. We think that in this regard, there's direct liability to an international community that functions because it was through their recognition, for example, of a despot, when we're talking about the Arab Spring, or it's through their recognition of Russia's supremacy or Kosovan independence that caused these people to be stateless. That means that their national citizenship that they argue for and their independent citizenship that they argue for are incompatible with this debate because you can't put blame on any one nation. What we would concede, though, is it's a UN responsibility, an international, multilateral responsibility to fix this problem. And that's why we think that this is the most apt solution. Finally, very quickly, why are camps bad? We think, Mr. Speaker, that there is no model in either side of the House that are going to say, leave the refugees, leave the stateless back to their home countries. They're either going to be nationalized through benevolence, or they're going to be sequestered in camps. These camps, Mr. Speaker, are the worst of places. There's no food, there's no employment. Basically, you turn them into second-class citizens. Basically, you construct enmity with their culture. You basically make an enemy out of a victim already. Why is this gravely unacceptable? It's because the principle of non-refoulement was designed to minimize and guarantee two basic rights. Decent quality of life, one, and two, your right to safety. So, are you safe in these camps, wherein you have no right to property, you have no right to opportunity, you have no right to livelihood? Are you given decent quality in these camps, when you have to count on rations surviving to feed your entire families? We think that we wouldn't allow any nation, first or third world, to hide behind these camps and say that this is how they're going to solve their obligation to the Treaty of Non-Refoulement. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we think that on both practical and principled levels, there is no way we can accept a model that doesn't guarantee universal citizenship. Thank you.
Thanks for the speech. Continue case for opposition and right member.
We promise you two new extensions coming from closing opposition. Firstly, how your policy will destroy states' ability to plan for the future, thus breeding xenophobia. And secondly, how your argument, which promotes the transfer of responsibility, is not a sustainable solution to its conflict resolution. I'm going to draw you a few trend analyses of post-Soviet states which work better on your policy than merely running away from the state, thus not getting full autonomous right. Before that, a couple of rebuttals. Let's engage with closing's extension. It was very unique. They said that states should be liable because direct liability exists. Because the international community chose to recognize Kosovo, which led to its subsequent harms, that's why every state should be liable. There are two responses to that. First one is the philosophical one. Because whenever you want to run an argument, reciprocity must exist. It is extremely odd. If the international community legislates good decisions, the international community will not get anything in return. But when the international community legislates bad decisions, the international community must bear the brunt of that mistake. A parallel can be the oil contracts which happened in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. If the oil contract worked, America will still not get it. At the same time, if the oil contract failed, America will still not get it. Because reciprocity exists. Their policy is not reciprocal at all. But my second response, what about non-participatory states? States which are neutral. Malaysia and Singapore, or Malaysia particularly, who still didn't choose to recognize these particular states, who are not complicit in that action. Why must these states also be responsible? Something which that side hasn't answered. They just say it's United Nations burden without arguing why United Nations should also form Malaysian liability as well. Let's deal with opening, because they were funny as well. They say that moral obligation exists because the principle of common humanity is there. And their parallel was drawing it to aid. There's a clear difference between aid and granting citizenship. Because your ability to grant aid depends on the will of the people on the ground. You don't force a person to give aid, ladies and gentlemen. But under your policy, it's not moral obligation, it is moral coercion, because you are forcing other states to accept actors who they do not accept. That's the clear difference here. So their principle doesn't stand in this debate. Sit down. Secondly, this is also something which closing tried to extend, alright? They say that there will be political capital to accept them because there's utility, because these people will work for the country. I have two responses. One, we think utility is stronger under our model because you need to go through naturalization and you need to apply to get that job. That means the state will decide what level of utility best serves them. Under your policy, it will no longer be a utility because now millions of people will swarm into your state. To an extent, it will become a burden. That's the difference. The example is the maid trade which happens in Malaysia, right? Maybe Malaysia only needs 50,000 maids. Under your policy, if you extend it, it might be 1 million maids entering Malaysia at one point in time. It's no longer a utility, but it becomes a burden. The point here, leave it to the state, because the state knows what's best for itself, not a few million people out there. Sit down. Finally, the assumption that nationalism will exist, because I choose that country, suddenly I will love that country. That is merely speculative, ladies and gentlemen, especially since you characterize these people entering the country because of convenience, because it's so near. So merely your assumption that nationalism will exist is merely speculative. Nationalism will be stronger under our policy because you will be forced to go through the process of naturalization and you need to apply to get into the country. Nationalism will be concretized under our policy, but it's merely speculative under your policy. Sit down. My argumentation. How will your policy destroy the state's ability to plan for the future? We need to recognize one thing. Planning for the future is not a simple thing. There is welfare, property development, and long-term policy. But all these kind of things are premised on the size of the populace of that country. That's why regulation is so important, so that the state will know that I should only accommodate towards 24 million people in Malaysia and maybe 4 million people in Singapore. Under your policy, you will disrupt that national calculus once you open the floodgate of hell. Because now there will be a massive entrance of people into Thailand from Cambodia, ladies and gentlemen, which will disrupt the state welfare system. That means the state will never have the ability to plan for the future at the detriment of the domestic populace. There are two harms here. The first harm, you will breed xenophobia. It's already bad that these people are taking their jobs, are taking their welfare, but more importantly now, they know that there's a long-term harm, not only to them, but their children, ladies and gentlemen, because the state cannot plan for their children. But the second harm is that you will hurt Myanmaris who have successfully naturalized in Thailand. Because these Myanmaris, ladies and gentlemen, have gone through the tremendous and rigorous process of adapting to as a nation. The point is, a person who's from Thailand cannot differentiate whether you have naturalized or whether you enter under their policy. So I discriminate both individuals. Individuals who have naturalized and individuals who just entered. And we think that's a harm to individuals who deserve to be in the country. Sit down. Opposition, this will directly engage with CEO's argument. CEO say like, oh, discrimination will not happen because most countries are already melting pots. We already have Bangladeshis in other countries, right? That's different. Because those Bangladeshis who enter Malaysia and other countries, the reason why we don't discriminate them, because we know that they deserve to be in this country. That they are successfully naturalized in this country. They've gone through the process of application. Under your policy, you are circumventing all that process, which means that you are circumventing the trust of the domestic populace. What does this mean? Before I move on, closing.
You know, it's more expensive to maintain a war in the Middle East or camps that have no return on investment.
Nice.
Where are you gonna put
Beautiful.
the refugees?
Beautiful. This will move into my second argumentation, why the transfer of responsibility is worse. Let's engage why is our solution better and more sustainable. Let's look at the context of Rohingyas, right? We think it's better for them to stay in Myanmar in masses because media sensationalization will exist. Media scrutiny will be there and political capital will be larger because you're looking at nearly 20% of the populace who are being oppressed. That's why, ladies and gentlemen, we granted Timor-Leste sovereignty because we recognize that a lot of people were demanding for it. That's why most post-Soviet states gained sovereignty, ladies and gentlemen, because they demand in a group. Under your policy, you create a cop-out, an easy way out, where most Myanmaris will just run out, ladies and gentlemen. The government of Myanmar will be happy because the government knows if I continuously crack down on the people, I can just get away from the problem because these Rohingyas will just move to Thailand and Malaysia in the long run. But more importantly, it's more harmful because it's not sustainable. Because there will still be some Rohingyas who still stay in Myanmar, but their voice will be less. Political capital will be less because they are no longer moving as a multitude, as a group. They are moving as a small block. Fundamentally, under our policy, we get sovereignty. We get what they want. In just the same way how Timor-Leste gets sovereignty, how most post-Soviet states got sovereignty from the Soviet region, ladies and gentlemen. For all those reasons, side with closing opposition.
Okay. Thank the speaker for his speech. To sum up the case for the government bench and invite the government.
Here, here.
Okay.
Let's quickly do away with Sadik's argument that, well, it's better for them to stay in the places where they're refugees in. Because if you look at the context of the Soviet Union before it collapsed, you have a lot of individuals who migrated to other places, who went to other places as refugees or as stateless people because they were affected by the collapse of the Soviet Union. You had the Lyukins, you have the Karolis, you had Nadia Comaneci, who went to another country and developed there, who had sustainable growth there. We think that his points were ridiculous. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that opposition never had a principal clash in this debate to begin with. Because the first thing that we told you from a POI, which they never responded to, was that all of their arguments fall on the assumption that they can't afford it, without considering the principle behind why they should afford it, assuming they could. Because we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is the reason why you have the United Nations principle of non-refoulement. Because the idea there is, you're never going to know when you're going to be stateless as well.
Here.
That's why you have to protect that principle, because you never know when you're going to be helpless, and when you're helpless, you want other people to help you as well. But on the first level, we think, ladies and gentlemen, it's more expensive for you to moderate foreign conflicts. It's more expensive for you to fund the conflicts in the Middle East. It's more expensive for you to fund the government in Syria or the opposition in Syria, as opposed to you just accepting the stateless people because of the conflicts that are happening there, especially sit down in a context wherein these people can freely contribute to your economy. But on the second level, we think that the first world does need laborers as well. Especially, we don't even concede to their idea that you're going to suddenly steal jobs from your citizens now. Because the jobs that these stateless people take, if you haven't noticed, are the jobs that the people from that state wouldn't want to take anyway. That's why you have Mexicans who are gardeners or pool boys in the United States, because these are the jobs that the white Americans wouldn't take because they have such pride. Sit down. But on the last level, we think that these camps are dead, and these investments are so costly because you're not investing in anything anyway. You're investing in a people who will stay there and stagnate there because they think it's better for them to stay there than to go to their own country where they're going to be continuously oppressed. We think that all of their cases lied on the assertion that it's very expensive, which we think, juxtaposed to the idea that we told you that these countries fund conflicts in the Middle East, these countries don't get anything out of these refugees, we think it's more expensive in that context. Before I proceed to the question of this debate, opening.
So why should Spain's public failing public housing system and its collapsing economy support the weight of immigrants from a war it never supported?
First and obvious rebuttal, I don't think if Spain's housing projects are failing, a stateless person would go there if he doesn't think that he has a chance to develop there, right? But on the second level, we think this increases incentives for other countries to fund countries who have universal citizens going there. If you suddenly have an influx of universal citizens going to the United States of America, then the US can get aid from other countries, right? We think that your idea of aid can also exist in this model because now you have other countries that are freely investing in your country because there are universal citizens there that were displaced because of your actions in the past. Sit down. First question of the debate. Is this the best way to make reparations for past injustices? And this was the first constructive that Daryl launched, which Sadiq never responded to. The idea that there is political collateral damage, that people who aren't intended victims are victims nonetheless. We think, ladies and gentlemen, you left a multitude of people sit down who are left stateless. You have 10.4 million people in Asia who are left stateless right now just because of the conflict between Bangladesh and between India and Israel and Palestine and all those other countries in conflict. You have the Arakan people who subjected themselves to stealing an identity of Myanmar, of a Burmese culture, by killing the original Arakan people. Just because they were displaced from Bangladesh, now they felt that they had to steal another country's identity just because they had nowhere else to go. We think that we don't want to subject these stateless people to these kinds of acts. We don't want to push them to the wall and force them to do things that they would later regret in the future. But on the second level, we think that this is a reparation for one, the deaths that happened in the past, the international community's inability to take action with regard to the people's situation in the past, and the loss of their territories as well. Why is this choice so important now? Why is this choice that only universal citizenship can give so important? We think that this prevents any further harm from being attributed to the first world nations or the countries that left them displaced to begin with. Now, if there's something that's going to be bad in their lives, they can blame themselves and they can do something to fix it and stop complaining to the international community. But on the next level, what does universal recognition do? And this is what citizenship does, right? It's basically recognition. Sit down. The first is, you recognize that they were oppressed, and this will give these people catharsis. This will give these people the idea that you don't have people who have genocide denial, who have Holocaust denial, which actually is the content of the nightmares of a lot of Jews in America. But on the second level, you recognize that they are a people that need to be respected. But on the last level, you recognize that they have to live with these people. That's why we think that the argument about discrimination is false. Because even if you discriminate against these people, then the law can hold you liable for it, right? We don't think that's the point. Sit down. But lastly, we think that the reason why we think that if you're gonna argue that it's not fair, it's more unfair for states to keep giving to these people without getting anything back. We think even if this person will be going to another country, indirectly, you're still going to be contributing to the global market anyway. We think you're contributing to the society that wants to sustain your humanity, that wants to maintain your status as a human. Sit down. Second question to debate. Where do we protect the interests of national security? Because they told you, ladies and gentlemen, that sit down, that discrimination is going to happen and that this is necessarily harmful. This is where Isla's first rebuttal came in. Where is it worse? In a situation where they're discriminated, assuming they will be discriminated, or in a situation where they don't have a future at all? I think I'd rather be discriminated if that's the case. But on the second level, they can escape out of these countries. This is the beauty of universal citizenship. If a Burmese person is going to be discriminated in Thailand, then he can go to the Philippines where we're friendly, right? But on the last level, we think that this was also an extension of Daryl's rebuttal, that you have to crack down on these acts. We think that this is something that you can do. On the second level, we think society doesn't have an absolute say with regard to the number of people that they can accept. Because the last thing I checked, even in naturalization, they don't vote who they accept and who they don't, right? The principle there is this. You need to make sure that you accept the people who want to go to you for help because they are helpless. Your society can end up helpless in the future. That's why you need to preserve this principle. I already discussed this earlier on. But the last question to debate is this. Where do we better the stateless people situation? Is it in a place where they don't have a future, or in a place where they can have development, development in the future? We think it's on our model where they can sustain their lifestyle, where they can finally build their own roots, because we think you don't necessarily even harm the people who are naturalized. We don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that's not responsive to Daryl's characterization that states are not are not homogeneous, we think, ladies and gentlemen, that we don't want these kinds of cultures to exist. With all that in consideration, we're proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for his speech. To continue to some of the case for the opposition and debate as a whole, invite the opposition.
Let's just get straight into this. First point of contention, how do we settle the refugee ping pong game of them being thrown back and forth? Secondly, what's best for the stateless individuals? Lastly, is it really a moral obligation? I might switch it, then just bear with me. First issue, right? This is refugee game thrown back and forth. Let's handle the first issue. This is what they said. These individuals they're in a political dilemma. These individuals are now, victims of a political war that we have right now. So first things first, this is what I said. She said no one would help these individuals because it's a political dilemma. They would, blacklist me because I accept these individuals in. Number one, we don't think that's true because there will still be help. I mean, even in very instance, right, the individuals or these countries themselves who have oppressed the individuals on the ground are already getting flack for the oppression themselves. So we don't think that necessarily these countries will be like, oh, I'm so scared to accept the Burmese because Myanmar won't be friends with me. No, we don't think so. We think there's a lot of political clout, and the international community is on board with this for any country that oppresses its individuals. So we don't think, number one, that exists from the very beginning, right? So we think that number two, we also see the international community has immense pressure on these individuals as well. This is why you see sanctions in Burma, right? Showing that because of the fact that the junta have oppressed the Burmese themselves. So we don't think that in that instance, no one would help them. Sit down. Even in the most controversial conflict, right, Mr. Chair, let's take Israel and Palestine. PRs were still given. Jordanian PRs were still given towards the Palestinians, and they still were able to self-actualize. They still were able to get jobs because of the fact that they were able to go and get their jobs and continue their lives. So we don't think, number one, that's not too bad, and then that's not too bad. So we don't think that people are not going to help them at all. Let's go to the issue, right? Camps are dead. First things first. Number one, these individuals don't have to stay in those camps because they can also opt out as well. Number two, even if these individuals want to stay in those camps, it's not the point. The policy then is not to go and have a universal citizenship. It's to make the camps better, right? So we don't think that's kind of policy. It's a mismatched solution, right? Make the camps better, and some camps are actually pretty good because these individuals are given healthcare. They're given, and sometimes even point where they even have mini schools or classes within these camps as well. So we don't think in that instance that we should just completely remove, or the camps should not be. The camps are not a viable option. Sit down. Secondly, they will retaliate politically, right? Because number one, we've already seen in this instance, let's say, the Burmese refugees who have fled to other countries like the United States, Malaysia, or even the Philippines. Number one, we don't see the Burmese government, for example, retaliating to all these other countries because they cannot. In the day and age, Mr. Chair, of interdependence, right, economically, politically, we think that it's political suicide for the countries who, number one, have committed oppression, to then also isolate the countries which they have trade with and they rely on, Mr. Chair. So we think that's politically stupid. So we don't think in that instance that would help. Sit down. This is what they said. I'll take you later. This is the idea of perception, right? This is what they say that the ping pong game, because right now these individuals will be seen as scum. We don't want them to come in. Number one, we disagree. We think that's not that kind of bigotry that we want from this side of the house. We still do realize that in the international community do see these refugees as individuals who are in need. Hence the moral argument that they want to talk about. So we don't think the scum thing would actually exist. Secondly, how is giving universal citizenship would change the perception even if they really thought they were scum? I don't think so. Just because you're given universal citizenship, I would probably be more pissed off. Because the fact is you can go anywhere you want. I mean, let's see, just ignoring the slight shaft that closing did, right? Because their policy was you can go anywhere and not and opt out easily too. So we think that in that instance, perception would still not change, ladies and gentlemen, because these individuals would still be seen as scum. First point, closing.
I really love the concession, because if you're going to say that you're going to make camps better, what then is the marginal difference between making them contributing members of your society? Are they liable?
No. Look, that's one of the second issue, right? It's really a moral obligation. This is what they said. It's a moral obligation to help, and then it's a moral obligation to help. Yes, but in the capacity of the state is able to help. Aid, shelter, food, these are the things that can already help. Even when it comes to political capital, we can even have sanctions towards these countries. So we don't think help, it's really that arbitrary. You have to give citizenship. Never really saying that citizenship is the only way to go, because there are other alternatives that are probably more effective, right? So then it's an inconsistency coming from opening at least. If it was really a moral and common good, then why is it so hard to opt out when it's so easy to opt in? So we don't don't think that's something that should be helping out. But what is really moral coming from this side of the house? It's a balance, right? It's not like none of these states would accept the refugees in status quo. They will, but it's on a case-by-case basis, right? Yes, it depends on the priority. Most of these refugees on the top of the list because of the need that they do. But why do you then, completely eradicate the autonomy of these states to decide what is good for their states? Because they have the citizens too, because it's their mandate to protect the citizens, right? Now what do they say? What is closing say? We need to manage funds, why go to wars? Let's have better camps. I mean, honestly, right, that's the state's decision. If you want to go to wars, if you want to have better environment policies, why do you have to encroach on that, right? So we don't think that in that instance that's a good enough argument. Now let's go to the last issue, right? Sit down. Now let's go to the last issue, right? What's best for these stateless individuals? Number one, we think that let's go into the argument that Daryl talked to you about, the idea of collateral damage. Then they said, what, the UN recognized Kosovo, therefore they should have at least its reciprocity, and then therefore we should allow these citizens to go and have universal citizenship. Number one, that's not how it's done. It's not like the UN makes up decisions and willy-nilly and says, hey, this is probably good, and then we completely forgot there's a whole other state of individuals that are being left out. No, they have not done that. The UN also reciprocates to ensure that these individuals are still protected. They can also help these individuals when it comes to processing visas or go to other places to get PR. So we don't think that then the UN will completely eradicate it, right? Sit down. Now let's go to the second issue. This is something they never tackled on Sadiq's point. We want to talk about acceptance of these individuals, right? Acceptance within these states. How is the acceptance much, much better when you give universal citizenship, right? Sit down. Because when it comes to status quo, right, even though there is a marginal problem of xenophobia, at least in that instance, the citizens know that they have to go through an arduous process. To go through, and they know what happens within that instance. That's why nationalization is much easier. You have to memorize the national anthem, you have to know the history of that country. When it comes to universal citizenship, no yardstick whatsoever applies. Patriotism is something that you cannot measure under their proposal because they just enter without any calculus or without any confirmation that this individual will be patriotic towards my country, right? Let's go to the transfer of responsibility within Sadiq's argument, right? We think that it's better for these countries to resolve conflict when there are individuals there who want the conflict to be resolved. Because in this instance, right, where there's a multitude of individuals within that instance, it's a larger group that's being oppressed. There's a higher possibility or higher tendencies for mediation to occur. Because once there are less individuals, right? Once there are less individuals who are less individuals within Palestine, right? What's the tendency that, what are they fighting for? Look, the Palestinians don't even want to fight for their own state because they left for Jordan, they left for Kuwait, they left for other rich Arab countries, right? So we don't think that in this instance the possibility of conflict resolution would occur. Even more so, you are also acknowledging the fact that whatever the oppressive country is acting upon towards the people is right. That means what you are saying that the Burmese government is right in oppressing the Rohingyas because they were forced to leave, and you're saying that the Israelis were right as well in forcing the Palestinians to leave and encroach onto their property. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just about autonomy of state. It's about what's best for these individuals and what's the best way to resolve conflict. CO takes his bait.
Thank everyone for the debate. Let's wash your hands, wait outside.
Oh, and your lap.
Okay, I'm going to take some time.